There is a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when a doctor looks at a scan, then looks at a patient, and says 4 words that change everything. Your knee is gone. Not damaged, not bruised, gone. The cartilage, that soft, miraculous cushion that has absorbed every step you have ever taken, worn down to nothing. Bone grinding against bone. Every footstep now a small act of destruction. This is the moment millions of people around the world receive every single year. And for most of them, the answer that follows is always the same. Rest, medication, surgery, replacement. But in 1997, in a small rehabilitation clinic in rural China, a 63-year-old farmer named Wei Longshan walked out of that clinic and did something his doctors had told him was impossible. He walked up a mountain, backwards, every morning, for 6 months straight, and when he returned to that same doctor, the scan told a story that nobody in that room knew how to explain. The cartilage that was gone, had partially returned. The inflammation had vanished. His pain score had dropped from a 9 to a 1. The doctor called it an anomaly. Wei Longshan called it a walk. This is not a story about miracles. This is not alternative medicine or ancient mysticism or wellness trends wrapped in pseudoscience. This is a story about biomechanics, neuroplasticity, muscle activation, and one of the most underestimated movements the human body is capable of performing. This is the science of walking backwards, and what it does to your knees, your brain, and your entire nervous system. Stay with me, because what comes next is going to change the way you think about movement forever. To understand why walking backwards heals the knee, you first need to understand why walking forward destroys it. Let us go inside the joint. The knee is not a simple hinge. It is an engineering masterpiece, a meeting point of 3 bones, the femur above, the tibia below, and the patella in front. Wrapped around this intersection is a complex web of ligaments, tendons, muscles, and that precious layer of articular cartilage, a substance so unique that the human body has never truly learned how to regenerate it at scale. Cartilage has no blood supply. Read that again. Cartilage has no blood supply. It cannot heal the way skin heals. It cannot repair itself the way muscle repairs itself. It receives its nutrients entirely through compression and decompression, through the mechanical squeezing of synovial fluid in and out of its porous structure, like a sponge that must be squeezed and released to stay alive. Now here is the critical question. Which part of the knee receives the most compression during normal forward walking? The anterior, the front section. Every time you take a forward step, your knee flexes, your quadriceps fire to control the descent, and the patellofemoral joint, the junction between your kneecap and your thigh bone, absorbs a force equal to 3 to 5 times your body weight. For a person weighing 70 kilograms, that is 210 to 350 kilograms of force, with every single step. Over decades, the anterior cartilage wears first. The medial compartment, the inner side, follows. The damage accumulates silently, invisibly, until the morning arrives when you stand up from bed and feel that grinding, that stiffness, that dull ache that does not leave. This is osteoarthritis. It affects over 500 million people globally. It is the leading cause of disability in adults over 60. And for the vast majority of sufferers, conventional medicine offers a single trajectory, progressive decline, culminating in total knee replacement surgery. But here is what the conventional model missed. It missed the geometry, because the knee is not one surface. It is multiple surfaces, multiple compartments, and, most importantly, the anterior compartment and the posterior compartment do not experience the same forces under the same conditions. And this is where everything changes. In 2003, a team of researchers at the University of Oregon published a study that should have made international headlines. It was titled simply, Retro Walking and Knee Joint Mechanics. What they discovered was geometrically elegant. When a human being walks backwards, the entire biomechanical signature of the gait cycle inverts. The heel strike, which in forward walking sends a shockwave up through the ankle, tibia, and into the knee, disappears. Instead, the toe makes contact first, and the foot rolls back to the heel in a controlled, cushioned motion. This single change redistributes the compressive load across the knee joint in a fundamentally different pattern. The anterior compartment, the worn, damaged, overtaxed front section is unloaded. The compressive forces that normally concentrate there during forward locomotion are reduced by up to 40%. Simultaneously, the posterior compartment, The back section, typically underused and underloaded, receives increased controlled stimulation. The cartilage in the posterior region, which has been relatively dormant for years, suddenly experiences the rhythmic compression and decompression it needs to absorb synovial fluid, receive nutrients, and, in some documented cases, begin the slow process of structural recovery. But the geometry is only half the story, because the real transformation is not happening at the cartilage level alone. It is happening at the muscle level. During forward walking, the primary muscle groups engaged are the quadriceps, the massive muscles at the front of your thigh, and the hip flexors. These muscles are chronically overactive in most modern adults, shortened by hours of sitting, pulling the pelvis into anterior tilt, and loading the knee joint in a pattern that reinforces wear. During backward walking, the primary muscles engaged are the hamstrings, the posterior chain of the thigh, and the gluteus maximus, the largest and most powerful muscle in the human body. Functional MRI studies from the Beijing Sport University in 2011 showed that backward walking activated the gluteus maximus at 140% of the activation seen during equivalent pace forward walking, 140%. And when the glutes fire properly, something remarkable happens to the knee. The femur, the thigh bone, rotates slightly externally. The patella, the kneecap, tracks into a more optimal alignment. The medial and lateral forces across the joint balance. And the grinding, the impingement, the pain, for many people, begins to quiet. Not because you are resting the knee, because you are loading it correctly for the first time. This is not anecdote. This is not tradition. The evidence is real, peer-reviewed, and growing. In 2012, a randomized controlled trial, published in the Journal of Rehabilitation Medicine, studied 60 patients with confirmed knee osteoarthritis. Half performed standard physiotherapy, half added backward walking to their rehabilitation program. After 8 weeks, both groups showed improvement, but the backward walking group showed something the standard physiotherapy group did not. Significantly greater reduction in pain on the Womack osteoarthritis scale, significantly greater improvement in stair climbing capacity, and measurably improved muscle strength in the posterior chain. The researchers noted that the greatest gains were seen in patients who had the most anterior compartment involvement, exactly the patients for whom backward walking most effectively redistributes load. In 2016, researchers at Manipal University in India followed 30 patients with patellofemoral pain syndrome, the diagnosis given to people whose kneecap tracks incorrectly, creating intense pain during stairs, squatting, and prolonged sitting. This condition is notoriously stubborn. Standard treatment has limited success rates. The backward walking group in this study trained for 4 weeks, 30 minutes per session, 3 sessions per week. At the end of 4 weeks, pain scores had dropped by an average of 61%. Functional scores had improved by 44%, 61% reduction in 4 weeks, without drugs. Without surgery, without a single needle or scalpel. There is also the question of what backward walking does to proprioception, the body's internal sense of joint position. One of the lesser-known consequences of knee osteoarthritis is proprioceptive decline. The mechanoreceptors embedded in the knee's ligaments and cartilage, the sensors that tell your brain exactly where your knee is in space, degrade as the joint degrades. This proprioceptive loss creates a devastating feedback loop. You lose precision in your movement. You compensate incorrectly. The joint wears faster. The sensors degrade further. Backward walking directly interrupts this cycle, because walking backward is neurologically demanding. You cannot do it on autopilot. You must attend to the ground, to your foot placement, to the position of your knee, your hip, your center of gravity. Every step backward is a small act of sensory recalibration, forcing the nervous system to reinvest attention in the joint it had begun to abandon. Studies measuring proprioceptive accuracy before and after backward walking programs show consistent improvement. The brain relearns the joint. The joint, responding to better mechanics and increased neural attention, begins to function more efficiently. And then we arrive at the part of this story that most people do not expect, because the healing does not stop at the knee. In 2009, a research team at Radboud University in the Netherlands conducted an experiment that had nothing to do with knees. They were studying memory. Specifically, They were studying whether physical movement could influence the retrieval of memories. They showed participants a short, distressing film clip. Then they divided participants into 3 groups. One group walked forward. One group stood still. One group walked backward. The group that walked backward showed significantly stronger and more accurate recall of the details in the film than either of the other 2 groups. The researchers theorized that backward movement may activate a specific cognitive state, a kind of heightened temporal awareness, that strengthens memory consolidation and recall. Walking backward, they suggested, may metaphorically and neurologically evoke the act of going back in time, activating memory systems associated with retrospective processing. This was a single study. Provocative, but preliminary. What followed was not. In 2010, the same research group published a follow-up study showing that participants who imagined walking backward showed improved performance on tasks requiring working memory and cognitive flexibility. The mental simulation of backward movement alone was sufficient to produce measurable cognitive effects. By 2015, neuroscientists were using functional MRI to examine what actually happens in the brain during backward locomotion compared to forward locomotion. The findings were striking. Forward walking, once learned, recruits the cerebellum and the basal ganglia in a highly automated, low-attention pattern. It is running on a program, a deeply embedded, energy-efficient program that requires minimal conscious involvement. Backward walking disrupts this automation entirely. The prefrontal cortex, the executive command center of the brain, responsible for planning, attention, working memory, and decision-making, activates significantly more during backward walking than during forward walking. The anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's conflict monitoring and error detection system, shows increased engagement. The hippocampus, the structure at the center of spatial navigation and memory formation, activates in a qualitatively different pattern. Backward walking does not just use more brain, it uses different brain. It forces the prefrontal cortex to stay online. It demands spatial recalculation with every step. It activates the cerebellum in novel coordination patterns. It engages the vestibular system, the balance and orientation apparatus of the inner ear, in ways that forward walking does not. And here is why this matters enormously. The prefrontal cortex is the first region of the brain to show measurable atrophy in the early stages of cognitive decline. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, age-related dementia, all of them share, in their earliest phases, a pattern of reduced prefrontal engagement, reduced executive function, reduced working memory capacity. Any activity that reliably, repeatedly, and safely forces the prefrontal cortex into high engagement is, by neurological definition, exercising the very tissue that cognitive decline attacks first. A 2019 study from the University of Roehampton followed adults aged 60 to 75 through a 12-week backward walking program. Cognitive assessments before and after the program showed significant improvements in working memory, selective attention, and processing speed, the exact cognitive domains most vulnerable to age-related decline. The participants did not take supplements. They did not use brain training apps. They did not follow complex protocols. They walked backward for 30 minutes, 3 times a week, and their brains responded as if they had been given something that no drug on the market has ever reliably delivered, a measurable reversal of the cognitive aging clock. There is a statistic that haunts geriatric medicine. Falls are the leading cause of injury-related death in adults over 65. In the United States alone, more than 36 million falls occur among older adults every year. 3 million of those result in emergency room visits. Over 30,000 result in death. But the falls themselves are not the real tragedy. The real tragedy is the fear of falling, and what that fear does to a person. When an older adult falls and is injured, or even when they fall without injury, the psychological aftermath frequently includes a dramatic reduction in physical activity. They move less. They go out less. They interact less. This reduction in activity accelerates muscle loss, worsens balance, and dramatically increases the probability of the next fall. It is a spiral that begins with a single stumble and ends, for millions of people, in complete loss of independence. The prevention of falls, therefore, is not simply a medical objective. It is a preservation of human life as it is actually meant to be lived. And backward walking is one of the most powerful fall prevention tools science has ever discovered. Precisely because of what it does to the body's balance system. Balance is not a simple sensory function. It is the integration of three separate systems: the visual system, the vestibular system of the inner ear, and the proprioceptive system of muscles, tendons, and joints. When all three systems are functioning and communicating efficiently, balance is automatic and effortless. When any one system degrades, the others must compensate. Image degrades all three simultaneously. Backward walking trains all three simultaneously. The visual deprivation inherent in backward movement, the fact that you cannot see where you are going, forces your vestibular and proprioceptive systems to compensate with greater precision. Your inner ear works harder. Your ankle proprioceptors work harder. Your brain's integration of these signals becomes more rapid, more accurate, more robust. A landmark 2014 study at the University of Massachusetts measured dynamic balance during movement, in two groups of older adults before and after a 6-week training protocol. One group performed forward walking training. One group performed backward walking training. At the end of 6 weeks, the backward walking group showed 2.5 times greater improvement in dynamic balance scores than the forward walking group. 2.5 times. The researchers noted that the balance improvements seen in the backward walking group after 6 weeks were comparable to improvements seen in traditional balance training programs lasting 6 months. 6 months of traditional training, achieved in 6 weeks of backward walking, and the mechanism is not mysterious. It is simply that backward walking removes the visual crutch. It forces your body to trust its internal sensors. And as with all biological systems, the sensors that are challenged most consistently develop the greatest precision. At this point, you might be thinking, this sounds beneficial. But it must be difficult. Walking backward must be exhausting in a way that limits who can do it. The reality is more interesting than that. Backward walking at the same speed as forward walking burns approximately 30% more calories. The metabolic cost is higher, not because the movement is more strenuous in a painful sense, but because it is more neurologically and mechanically novel. More muscle groups are recruited. The nervous system is working harder. The body is spending more energy on coordination and sensory processing. For people managing weight alongside joint pain, a common and vicious combination, since excess weight accelerates joint degradation. Backward walking offers a metabolically efficient option that does not load the joints in the same destructive pattern as higher impact alternatives. A 2008 study in the journal Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise found that subjects walking backward on a treadmill at a comfortable pace achieved heart rates and oxygen consumption comparable to forward walking at significantly faster speeds. The cardiovascular stimulus was equivalent, at a pace that felt manageable and placed dramatically less stress on the anterior knee compartment. This means backward walking offers simultaneous rehabilitation and cardiovascular conditioning, something that is genuinely rare in the world of joint protective exercise. For someone recovering from knee surgery, or managing early osteoarthritis, or simply trying to stay active while protecting a vulnerable joint, this combination is not merely convenient. It is clinically transformative. We have focused primarily on the knee and the brain, but the structural effects of backward walking extend throughout the entire axial skeleton, and nowhere more significantly than in the lumbar spine. Chronic lower back pain affects approximately 620 million people worldwide. It is the single leading cause of disability globally. And like knee osteoarthritis, it exists in a biomechanical context that forward-only movement frequently reinforces. Most chronic lower back pain is associated with anterior pelvic tilt, the forward rotation of the pelvis that results from tight hip flexors and weak gluteal muscles. This tilt increases the lumbar lordotic curve, concentrating compressive and shear forces on the posterior elements of the lumbar spine, the facet joints, the intervertebral discs, the paraspinal muscles that must work overtime to maintain stability. Backward walking, by activating the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings, directly addresses anterior pelvic tilt. As the glutes strengthen and the hip flexors lengthen, the pelvis gradually returns to a more neutral position. The lumbar curve normalizes. The posterior compression decreases. In a 2020 randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Back and Musculoskeletal Rehabilitation, patients with chronic nonspecific low back pain were randomized to either standard physiotherapy alone or standard physiotherapy plus backward walking training. The backward walking group showed significantly greater improvements in pain, functional disability, and lumbar range of motion at both the 4-week and 8-week assessment points. The authors concluded that backward walking should be considered a standard component of conservative management for chronic low back pain, a recommendation that, as of today, the majority of physical therapy curricula have still not integrated. The implications are not subtle. We are describing a single movement, backward walking, that simultaneously addresses knee joint loading, posterior chain strength, pelvic alignment, lumbar spine mechanics, brain function, balance, metabolic efficiency, and proprioceptive recalibration, all from an activity that requires no equipment, no gym membership, no prescription, and no training beyond basic safety awareness. The science is established. The question now is practical. How does a person actually integrate backward walking safely, effectively, and progressively into their life? The first principle is environment. Backward walking carries an inherent collision risk. The ideal starting environment is a long, clear corridor, a quiet track, a treadmill set to a low speed, or an open outdoor space with a spotter. Many practitioners begin on a treadmill precisely because the constant surface eliminates the terrain variability that makes outdoor backward walking more cognitively and physically demanding. For treadmill backward walking, the recommendation for beginners is to start at 1 km per hour, a pace that feels almost comically slow when walking forward. Backward, it is not slow, it is deliberate. Start at this pace for 10 minutes. The early sessions will fatigue muscles you have never consciously felt: the posterior tibialis, the peroneals, the deep hip external rotators. This fatigue is not injury, it is activation. Increase duration by 5 minutes per week until you reach 30 minutes per session. Increase speed only after you have achieved confident form at the current speed. The target for most rehabilitation applications is 2 to 3 km per hour, 3 to 5 times per week. For outdoor backward walking, find a familiar flat surface, a quiet park path, a school track, an empty car park. Walk with a partner initially. The partner walks forward while you walk backward. They serve as your visual system, alerting you to obstacles, helping you maintain a straight line. Over weeks, as your proprioceptive confidence develops, you will find that you need less external guidance. The second principle is posture. The most common error in backward walking is leaning forward at the waist, a compensatory attempt to protect against falling. This forward lean negates much of the biomechanical benefit by reintroducing anterior loading patterns. Stand tall, lift through the crown of the head, engage the core gently, allow the foot to reach back, toe first, and roll deliberately to the heel. The third principle is gaze. Look forward or slightly upward. Do not look down at your feet. This maintains cervical spine alignment, activates the upper postural chain, and keeps the vestibular system in its optimal orientation. Begin with 3 sessions per week. Within 4 to 6 weeks, most people with knee osteoarthritis report measurable reduction in pain. Within 8 to 12 weeks, functional improvements in stair climbing, squatting tolerance, and daily ambulation are typically evident. The changes are not magic. They are mechanics. The biology responds to the demand you place upon it, and backward walking places a demand that the joint and the nervous system have been waiting, perhaps for decades, to receive. But there is a deeper question buried in all of this, one that transcends knee cartilage and prefrontal cortex activation and posterior chain recruitment. Why didn't we know this sooner? The answer is uncomfortable. Western medicine is, at its core, a system built around intervention. The pharmaceutical model, the surgical model, the device model, all are built on the premise that the body, when damaged, requires something external to repair it. A drug, a procedure, a replacement part. Movement, particularly movement as simple and cost-free as walking backward, does not fit this model. It cannot be patented. It cannot generate a billing code that sustains a hospital system. It does not require a specialist. And it requires something from the patient that a pill does not: consistency, attention, and personal responsibility. The research on backward walking has existed in physical therapy literature, sports science journals, and rehabilitation medicine for over 3 decades. It has been quietly validated, quietly replicated, and quietly ignored by the mainstream medical conversation. Wei Longshan, the farmer who walked backward up a mountain for 6 months and regenerated cartilage his doctors said was gone. His story is not the exception. Across China, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly in research institutions in Europe and North America, backward walking has accumulated a body of evidence that is impossible to dismiss. The only question is whether we are willing to look backwards, in every sense, to find the answer that was always there. There is a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when a person decides to try something that feels strange, not because it is safe, not because it is comfortable, not because they fully understand the mechanism behind it, but because the evidence is clear, the cost is zero, and the body they inhabit is asking, in the only language it knows, pain, stiffness, imbalance, fog, for something different. Walking backward is that something. It will feel strange the first time. Your muscles will protest. Your brain will resist the unfamiliarity. Every instinct you have developed over decades of forward movement will tell you this is wrong, this is unnatural, this is a mistake, but your knee will not agree. Your hamstrings will not agree. Your prefrontal cortex, lighting up with novel activation, firing pathways it has not used in years, will not agree. The human body did not evolve to move in only one direction. It evolved to climb, crawl, rotate, jump, squat, carry, and, yes, retreat. The backward gait pattern is encoded in your neuromuscular architecture as deeply as the forward gait pattern. It is not foreign, it is simply forgotten, and what is forgotten can always be remembered. Take your first backward step. It does not have to be up a mountain. It does not have to be 6 months long. It can be 10 minutes, on a quiet path, in the early morning, with no one watching, just backward, just you, just the body learning, relearning, what it has always been capable of. The science will not surprise you. But your body might.